I'd like to talk today about how to keep the Sabbath. Part 1, laboring to rest. That sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? But really, that's what's happening as we prepare for the Sabbath. We're investing additional labor so that we might enjoy the rest of the Sabbath. Anyone ever gone on a vacation? Not that I'm comparing the Sabbath with a vacation. But how many of you recognize that if you're going to have a vacation, a good vacation, requires a little extra work and preparation to enjoy the vacation? Would you admit that? It seems like sometimes you've got to recover from the vacation when you get home because it takes that extra energy. I believe that in order for us to really enjoy the release and the peace that God has designed for this blessed day, we must labor to enter that rest. And that involves some education. It involves some thinking. And it's one of those areas that is often misunderstood. But I'll get to that a little more in a moment. Back in 1924, at the Olympics, something historic transpired there in Paris. There was a Scottish missionary's son, Eric Liddell, who was a very talented runner. And he was scheduled to run a sprint in the Olympics. But he discovered that the time trials for his event were going to fall on Sunday, which was his Sabbath. And even though he had trained and prepared and his country had chosen him and invested in him, he said, not going to do it. Won't happen. And he was under an immense amount of pressure. Just this once. God will understand. Your country is counting on you. What's more important? There were politicians, teammates, some extended family members, not his mother and father, who supported what he was doing, that put incredible pressure on Eric to capitulate his convictions and just go ahead and run the time trials just this once. And he said, no, I can't even do it this once. He believed Sunday was a Sabbath, and he said, I'm not going to violate my conscience even if I die. Well, later, they wanted to use his talent for the country somehow. They found out that he could do the time trials for the 400-meter. And when he did the time trials, he didn't show very well. As a matter of fact, they were wondering if he would be able to finish at all compared to the other talented runners. But he said, you know, the results are with God. I don't question God. I'm going to do what he tells me to do, and the results are in his hands. And just prior to running that 400-meter race, even though he did poorly in the time trials, someone handed him a slip of paper that had a scripture on it. And it said very simply, those that honor me, I will honor. And when the gun went off and he ran that race, he not only won, he was 5 lengths ahead of every other runner, and he broke the world record. You know, later, he lived out his convictions. He died in a prisoner of war camp in Japan at the end of World War II, 1945, because he had been serving as a missionary in China. The man believed in obeying God. Now, let me tell you what has precipitated this message, or I should say this series of messages on how to keep the Sabbath. I believe that it is the devil's decided plan to erode our convictions through series of rationalizations and compromises, so that when the big test of the last days comes, and we must choose who we will worship at the point of death, so many of God's people have been so prepared and trained to compromise that we won't know how to take a stand. And it will be just as important that we are faithful in little things like keeping the Sabbath holy. That commandment is no less important to God than the one that says, do not murder and do not commit adultery. But it's difficult sometimes for us to wrap our minds around that. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But think about the stories in the Bible of the great heroes. You know, there are some Old Testament heroes like modern-day Eric Liddell, who, of course, you've got the story of Daniel. Daniel chapter 6. a political law is made that everybody must pray to King Darius for 30 days or they will be executed. You must not worship anyone or pray to anyone but the king for 30 days, just a little while. But Daniel had a custom of going to an upper room 3 times a day. He'd kneel on his knees in a physical posture of prayer. He would open his window so people could see him praying, and he would pray towards Jerusalem so people would know what God he worshiped. And when the law was enacted, Daniel had to make a choice. He actually had made the choice 1,000 times before, when 3 times a day he went to his upper room and prayed in this pagan land. You know, we were talking about this week in our staff meeting, and Pastor Mike was saying that he or a friend was somewhere where they saw this Muslim who, in the middle of a crowded public place at the time of prayer, he stopped, rolled out his prayer rug, and began to pray towards Mecca. And though it looked a little bit absurd, you had to respect the person's convictions. They did not care what anyone around them thought. They were more interested in what God thought. And here Daniel thought, even if I am torn limb from limb by lions, I would rather obey God than man, even if it's unpopular. And the thing that you must also respect is he did not make little compromises. How easy it would have been for Daniel to say, well, look, I don't want to offend the king. It might be a bad witness. I could look obnoxious, so I'm going to shut my windows. It could have been easy for Daniel to say, well, I'm going to stand in my window and face Jerusalem, but I'm not going to kneel because that looks too much like prayer. Or Daniel could have quoted that scripture, except the scripture hadn't been given yet. When you pray, enter into your closet. I mean, there would have been so many available rationalizations that he could have chosen to compromise, but he would not. Did God honor Daniel because he honored him? Delivered him, and his enemies were destroyed. Then in the same book, of course, you've got the 3 Hebrew worthies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Another government law. This is now chapter 3. It says, if anyone fails to pray to the golden image that I have set up, they are going to the flaming furnace that you could still see smoldering in the distance. Now, how easy it would have been for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say, when the music plays, let's all tie our sandals. I'm not going to pray to the image, but, we don't want to wreck the king's party. We'll just kneel down and tie our sandals. Or drop a contact lens. See if you can find it. Find some excuse to look like, or kneel down, but really pray to Jehovah in your heart. I mean, after all, that's all that matters. How many rationalizations they could have found to just cut the corners. But they said, no, we will not even look like we're failing to worship our God. They stood up for God, and did God stand up for them? Then, of course, you go to the book of Esther in another similar story, where one of the enemies of God's people was Haman the Agagite, who was related to the Amalekites, avowed enemies of God's people. First ones to attack the children of Israel when they left Egypt was the Amalekites. And a law was made by the king of Persia that says everybody was to bow and worship Haman. Mordecai said, I can't do that, even if it means I lose my life. And he knew that his whole people would be targeted. But even though it might react, even though his devotion might react in suffering on the rest of his people, he said, I'm not going to compromise. And there was a law made to exterminate all of God's people because he would not compromise. He stood up. Did God deliver his people? Now, here's my point, friends. If you read in Revelation chapter 13, verse 15, it tells us there's going to be a law enacted by the beast. And it says that this beast power is granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. A law is made regarding worship, and if you do not worship the way you're told, it's the death penalty. Now, follow me for a moment. Let's review a little history. The Bible tells us he that is guilty of breaking one commandment is guilty of all. The devil doesn't care whether your sin is adultery or murder. As long as he can get you to sin and separate you from God, it doesn't matter what commandment it is. And in God's book, the Sabbath commandment is not any less important or valuable than the other 9. Some people think that it's, well, it's sort of a personal preference